First of all, I would like to thank the H2O team for this invitation tonight to share the results of these research efforts, which, as Isabelle Michalet mentioned, fits within the values this project. This is a binational project, but which also fits within the framework of my residency, the Collegium de Lyon, in partnership with H2O and the IVS-UMR. It is within this context that I invite you to travel to the banks of rivers in the Usumacinta River catchment basin in Mexico and to examine the sediment extraction activities. And I will start with two photos where you'll be able to see landscapes, different landscapes. On the left-hand side, the upstream part of the catchment basin and the extraction of sediments taking place on the banks of the river, whereas on the right-hand side photo, you may see sediment extraction done by those I call the divers, sand divers. First, the Usumacinta catchment basin. It covers a surface area over 77,000 square kilometers. The main river, the Usumacinta, runs over approximately 1,000 kilometers, more than 300 kilometers within Guatemala, about the same length at the separation between Mexico and Guatemala, and the last portion of the river running up northward, which falls into the Gulf of Mexico. The Usumacinta catchment basin is supplied with a lot of water. In some locations, the rainfall exceeds 3,000 millimeters per year, and the various rivers, wetlands are present. And also, it should be noted, when it comes to the Usumacinta, these rivers do not always are not always referred to by the same name. It's called Usumacinta in the Mexican part, for example, but not on the Guatemala part. It is a trans-border catchment basin. 55% of the catchment basin is in Guatemala, 44% in Mexico, and less than 1% is in fact in Belize. There's a very small state called Belize, you see, which is there at the extreme right of this photo, or extreme east. You see this very, very little tip here. And for Mexico, there are three federate states: Chiapas in the upstream part, Tabasco in the middle part of the catchment basin, and Campeche in the downstream part of the catchment basin. So it is a three-national trans-border catchment basin, and the Belize part is minimal, minute, and has no political relevance as such. Having said that, when we consider the bilateral cooperation between Mexico and Guatemala, there is no cooperation when it comes to shared water, despite the fact that a major part of the river is in fact the borderline between Mexico and Guatemala. So it is an international river, and the river border is following the deepest channel, the Talweg. It is a very rural area. There are very, very few large cities, but it is a catchment basin where there is a very large number of natural protected areas. On the left-hand side, you see the green zones, which are the protected areas of the catchment basin on the Mexican side as well as on the Guatemala side, and they are, you see, upstream and downstream. So why do we want to study the sediment issue in the Usumacinta River, where sediments are all over the place? But it should be mentioned that Usumacinta is a so-called free river. That is, NGOs call it a free river. It's one of the rare in Mexico, with little hydraulic human intervention. There's only one dam upstream in Guatemala. And therefore, it is essential for the flow or the transport of sediment, despite the fact that the topic of dams on the Usumacinta is a recurrent issue, because since the 60s, the Mexican government plans to erect or build several dams. So it is a major catchment basin when it comes to sediment transport, and especially there are significant accumulation of sands, especially in the downstream part of the catchment basin in the Tabasco state. And as you may see on this photo here on the right-hand side, in several rivers in the upstream and middle portion of the catchment basin, as is the case in the Lacantum here. We can see as well significant fluctuation of water flow rates of the Usumacinta and all its tributaries between the dry season, between January and April, and the rainy season between May and October. And therefore, when the water level drops, in the bed of many rivers, on the Usumacinta River, several sandbanks or beaches are visible, and therefore these areas lend themselves to sediment extraction on the banks, and as you will see, in some cases, in the minor bed or the rivers. So there are also very high currents, strong currents. There are major islands, banks, large beaches. They call them playon in Spanish. For many villages, the playon, beyond the beach itself, is a meeting site. It has a social function. There are parties or celebrations, and the Usumacinta catchment basin also includes meanders, and erosion processes takes place, and frequent floods. So all this causes sediments to accumulate in various parts of the catchment basin. So the terrain, the zone of our study, which took place between 2018 and 2020, 13 sites were concerned. I will not detail the complexity thereof, and I won't show you a map either, because there is an element of confidentiality, which is linked to two main reasons. First is the issue of safety, or at least security of the research team, especially those who are in Mexico, because as we will see, this is this activity has several consequences because of the informal or extralegal dimension of it. Moreover, the second reason of confidentiality is the trust we received from those who allowed us to share their activities, to understand how their work progresses in sediment extractions and so on and so forth. Among the 13 sites, those who are in blue here are sites where we've been able to observe several conflicts. You will see that, in fact, we worked on the two banks of the Usumacinta rivers. The river, some in villages, some are organized in within the villages, and other are organized with other villages. Those are not the only sites, of course, of the Usumacinta catchment basin where sediments are extracted. We've identified 4 other sites where we would like, if possible in the future, we'd like to continue our research, on-site research, but it should be mentioned that most of the exploitations we visited are mainly local or artisanal. We only visited one industrial exploitation. Others do exist, but for our researchers, it is quite difficult to get close to these industrial exploitations because we, as social researchers, we ask many questions which could be difficult. We've also examined sites in Guatemala. So we did this work only in Mexican side, but Guatemala, in Guatemala, the security issues are much severe than in Mexico. So we did not go to the Guatemalan part of the catchment basin. So this trip today will address 4 questions. Who are the sand workers? They're called areneros in Spanish, the divers or the pickers. How does extraction take place? Why do they extract sediment? How are they organized, and how do they deal with the conflicts? So first, sediments. The very notion of sediment is almost unknown in the Usumacinta catchment basin, or at least not understood. When meeting a sand diver, a fisherman, I said, "Have you heard about sediment?" He said, "What? What sediments?" And he said, "Sediments? No, well, you know, I'm speechless. I don't know what this word means, sediment. I don't know." This is a person whose main activity is actually sediment extraction. Indeed, this notion of sediment does not appear in the law governing water management in Mexico, and is not used by the National Water Commission, which is the institution that regulates the sediment extraction operations. We talk about stone or building material. So the very concept, it's a concept which is mainly scientific and totally unknown from the local population, and even from the government or the administrations. So, stone building material, which corresponds to the designation of granular material in France. We talk about sand, gravel, a mix, but at the local scale, locally they talk about sand, mud, clay, loam, muck, powder sand, gravel. They even talk about crocodile and alluvium. So who are the sand workers? All the tables I will show you during this presentation, just to give you here a couple of quantitative data reporting our work on site. But the first column here of each table are percentage calculated as a function of the reference group or reference practice, whereas the second column is a percentage calculated as a function of the 13 reference sites. So just to give you an element of comparison at the scale of the practice of the reference element and at the global scale of the work on site. So sand workers are mainly men. You know, it's a male activity. The age segment depends on the site. It varies depending on the site, depending on the way extraction is carried out. So why is it mainly a male activity? Well, first of all, it is physically very demanding, and also due to the fact that there is a gender separation of work, where women, except when it comes to traveling to go from one place to another, but women do not use the river as a location where they would carry out activities beyond activities which exist on the banks of the river, such as washing clothes when they don't have access to drinking water at home, or other activities of the kind. So it's 100% male activity, also due to the fact that in some cases the sand workers initially are actually fishermen, real fishermen who turned into sand divers, or they actually are fishermen and sand divers, or sand fishermen, and they carry out the two activities. This sand worker world can be divided into three main groups. On the one side, there are the divers. The divers, as you see on this photo, those are men who dive with no equipment whatsoever. They go down to the bed of the river, down to 9 meters actually, especially in this site when the river is high water during the rainy season, and they use buckets or baskets to collect the sediments on the riverbed, and they put it on a craft. Usually it's a boat, fisherman boat, or in some other cases they could be basic pirogues or canoes, and then they bring it to the shore. Then there are also the fishermen, sand fishermen. Well, they perform their activities mainly in the river, of course. They're in the water up to the torso, basically. They are partly in the water, and they just collect the sand or the sediment and load the boat. And the third category are so-called the sand pickers. That's the way I call them, on the banks. So they pick the sand on the banks. It can be done with wheelbarrow, with shovels, and in some cases, actually, they will use mechanical devices. So when the fishermen and the divers are in the middle of the river, they need to bring the sediment load to the shore. They have to take the sediment to a dry zone, especially because in this river the floods can be sudden. They can be flash floods, so they do not want to lose their material. And they use, as I said, boats or crafts. Like you see this pirogue here, you can see here on this, on the right-hand side. It's made in plywood, and it will last 3 months. That is basically the picking or extraction season. When they get to the shore, to the banks, especially if there is a steep slope between the river level and the land, where the terrain where they want to store the sediment on dry soil, where they would use pulleys or sheaves. Horses actually may be used to bring the sediments to the shore, because sediments are very heavy. Wheelbarrows, and in one case, actually, you see, there was a system designed. It was designed by a migrant from Honduras. It is basically a moped engine which makes it possible to lift sediments to the shore and to lighten the burden, of the divers and fishermen. It is also important to mention, like you can see on some of the photos, the erosion process taking place, and in some cases, for example, what I call the Christmas trees, when water level drops, solid waste which got trapped in the trees and remain there, and therefore the trees become some sort of pollution Christmas trees. Throughout the extraction chain, there will be several players or actors, so of course. Some are present throughout the extraction chain and others will be present in only some locations. So extraction of sediments, storage, commercialization, marketing, that is buying, selling. Sometimes there could be a system of donation or contribution or exchange. I'll mention that later on. Transport. In some cases, there can be intermediaries in the end or brokers and the transformation and final use. So who are the actors in the extraction process? Well, mainly this group are called as the divers, fishermen and pickers, the sand workers. There is another group who are those who operate the machines, mainly the excavators, those machines, and the heredatarios, who are they have the right owners of land tenure, which is a heritage from the Mexican Revolution. It's a collective form of land tenure, and it is also a form of social organizations. I mention it and I define it precisely because you will see they are a major player in sediment extraction. When talking about sediment extraction, we will see that we're dealing with very different situations or contrasting situation and inequalities. As you may see on the two photos here in the middle, we're in the same location here. There, on the one side, there is a small business which may extract 1,500 cubic meter of sand in 6 hours, and there are two divers who will extract 16 cubic meter in 8 hours of work. So it's quite a contrast, but it's not just the quantity, because the company will sell the sand at a lower cost, more accessible for the population. That will be, of course, for more unfair competition for sand divers, and there will be several of inequalities. But inequalities are also due to the presence of hierarchy between sand workers. It's not something if you're an employee, if you're a member of a cooperative, if you're a member of a syndicate, and it's not the same thing if you're a diver or if you're the one with the shovel here. So you will see that this is quite varied with a large diversity, and there are social and economic hierarchies. When it comes to the storage itself, usually it's mainly the inhabitants along the river, and who will be involved in the storage. Then there will be the heredatarios, and the ejido as a form of social organization. When it comes to the selling of the sediment, again, we see the main actors, the inhabitants who live along the river, and mainly it seems important to insist on the fact that in the cases we visited, the heredatarios are not allowed to sell sediments. They cannot be involved in the marketing or commercializing of sediments. They cannot earn income from the sediments because this is not allowed by the Erido. So this shows the importance of Erido as a social organization in the local system. Storage, where storage may take place in municipal collective zones, but it can also be done in domestic or household locations, in places where, sediments are not accessible all year round because the river will be inaccessible because of the flow rate or the level, and sediments cannot be extracted. So the sediments will be stored in a patio in order to have it available whenever necessary during the year. Let me point out as well that this photo here shows a house of a local farmer. We talk also about zones where these are very poor rural areas, and sediments play a key role as they will allow local population to have hard buildings or houses, So who buys the sediments? Heredatarios cannot sell, but they can buy sediments, and they usually, them and the inhabitants along the river who buy the sediments. They're the main actors. The Erido itself may buy sediments to another Erido, neighboring Erido. And what should be mentioned as well is that there are other ways to have access to sediments, but among Erido, through donation, for example. One Erido may decide to give the sediment to another one, and trade it for another service, such as an infrastructure or others. Or in some cases, the Erido will bring sediments when the government builds or restore a road, for example, who decides to erect some public works for the population. So it's a counterpart, actually, a collective contribution to a public work. Or when it comes to transport as well, transport of sediment may be done by individual actors, they can use their car, or it could be organized also by the syndicate, by transport syndicates, actually. Once the sediment has been transformed, and you will see that it's not often the case because we met very few actors who use sediments to transform the material. Well, usually it is the local artisan, on this photo. You see bricks, very basic bricks, which in fact crumble easily. And so when it is used or transformed, sediments are used or transformed, there are local artisans. And when it comes to end users, there is quite a higher number of actors, mainly the inhabitants along the river, the Heredatarios, and the Erido as a form of social organization. And especially, as we see on this photo, when something had to be built, like a local hall or basketball field. Now, sediment extraction in Mexico is governed by legislation. You need to have a land patent, which is granted by the National Water Commission, CONAGUA, on the basis of an environmental impact authorization, which is granted by the Ministry of the Environment, called the SEMARNAT, based on an environmental impact information that the operator requests from the government, from the ministry. All these land patents are recorded in the water rights public registry, and this is the formal legal dimension of sediment extraction legislation. Reality is somewhat different, as we shall see. We visited 13 sites, and we've observed, in fact, generally speaking, there are 5 main organizations for sediment extraction, among which the ERIDO is the main form of organization to understand this activity. Then there are organizations which are specifically dedicated to sediment extraction, such as cooperative or transport or sediment transport syndicates who use specialized trucks. And the private family businesses are in minority. What are the end purposes of extraction, generally speaking? Well, first, the auto-consumption or self-use. There will be, well, of course, purchasing and selling. And what I mentioned also, the counterpart for public works or in many cases, storage, family storage, medium or long-term storage. When it is possible to have access to sediment, well, people will store the sediment, considering that in a couple of months they will have enough money to build something, to have there a different house, or possibly develop something in their family. Among sand workers, about 1/3 do this are their main activities, and they sell the sediment. Another 1/3 of sand workers is for them it is a secondary or time-controlled activity during the dry season, depending on the location and the rivers. And 1/3 of cases, it is a specific random activity which may last a couple of days, couple of weeks, which provides extra income. Extraction techniques are basically, as I said, artisanal, but in some cases, and especially in the case of sand pickers, we are talking about mechanical extraction, mainly excavators that will extract sediment from the banks of the rivers. Concerning the formal instruments beyond the 3 main systems I mentioned, the land patent, the environmental impact authorization, and the environmental impact information, there are 14 instruments which have to do with public transport permits or the cooperative or syndicates. Well, there is a variety of formal instruments, yet if we are to compare this with the local collective standards, well, the diversity is much higher, wider at the local scale, even more so that when we observe on sites, when we do observe the 13 sites, we realize that only 23% of the 13 sites own land patents, and 23% of the sites have cooperative permits or act. So these are the highest percentage. At the local level or the local standards, the ERIDO agreements are the majority, form the majority when it comes to the regulation of sediment extraction. There are also the ERIDO authorizations, and in some cases, the person who wishes to extract sediment has to present a declaration to the ejido. So the ejido is clearly the form of social organization which is significant, important in Mexico, but which in the case of sediment extraction in the Usumacinta catchment basin is fundamental to understand the practices and the methods. When we look at the informal practices, this is where there is a multiplication of situations. There are several informalities, and we've observed 42 informal practices associated with sediment extraction, ranging from the lack of environmental impact information, the absence of environmental impact authorization, non-registered organizations, and especially 23% of the certain sites extraction which exceeds the land patent or the quantity authorized by the land patent, whenever the land patent exists. And as we've seen, in most cases, they do not exist. So despite the presence of standards or norms, extraction is very informal for very numerous reasons. Economic reason first. To do environmental impact information to obtain the authorization to obtain a land patent is quite expensive, and many farmers cannot do that, cannot afford it. You have to go to the capital city of the state, which means several hours of traveling. There is also red tape or bureaucratic systems, and you have to understand that for the inhabitants, for the ejidatarios, for sun workers, sediments is a resource which is considered as belonging to them, despite the fact that they know very well that legislation defines sediments as a public or as a common good, in as much as it is part of water. It is found in the water, and therefore, according to the Mexican Constitution and the Mexican water law, it is a national good. Or asset. So what happens with governmental actors? Well, the National Water Commission is mentioned often. It is the main actor of the Mexican federal government, often mentioned on site. But in most cases, they are not present. It is just a reference, but there are no representative on site, except when there is a major conflict, or when it is present, it may actually trigger conflicts. So there are locations where representatives from Conagua have never been seen, but it is nevertheless referred to. The Ministry of the Environment is never mentioned, whereas it is the one that's supposed to be granting the authorizations. And when it comes to mayors at the local municipal level, they're very present, while legally speaking, they have no power whatsoever. So what we will see on site is that the mayor will grant authorizations to exploit the plaion or other law situations, but in fact they are not considered by the legislation, because in Mexico the banks of rivers belong to the nation and are therefore governed by the national water law, and all authorizations are actually granted by the National Water Commission. So what do we see? Well, we see that there is a reference to the national water law. There is a knowledge of a formal legal situation, but all practices take place in compliance with this rating, but between legal and informal, between extra-legal and informal. There is also importance of the local agreements, the ejido, the syndicates, the cooperative, but also local rules are the main system, and therefore there is a distribution between local norms, between the formal and it gives a legitimacy to the local population, but mainly for the players who are involved in these extraction activities. Now, let me give you an example. If we visit a site called N, which is at the confluence of two rivers, in 2019, there was a very severe drought, and the flow rate of the river dropped. And as you may see here on the photo, back, excavators came to the river to pick the sediment, to extract sediments, and the H2O Assembly had decided that each family was allowed to get one truck of sediment. Of course, families pay for the extraction, but don't pay the sediment. They pay the work. They pay the labor. They pay the expenses associated with with the extraction, such as petrol, labor. But sediment is not sold as such. In this H2O, each house has a heap of sand or gravel, and we were told this was the only activity authorized, allowed at the time, simply. But the observation made it possible. In fact, we will see that on the site, on this very site, there was also a company of sediment transformation company, business. We were not able to get too close to it, and which shows clearly that there is difference between local standards and afterwards this extension of possibilities between the practices and the standards which are defined collectively by the H2O Assembly. It is an interesting site for another reason. This is a site where the sediment extraction activity was influenced by the building of a bridge over the river. It had impacts on the activity of the sand pickers. Now, to go deeper into this topic, sediments trigger some actions from the political system and power relationships. And you see here the relationship between the municipality, the sediment cooperative, the role of the sand divers or the sand workers, mainly those who work with the shovels, the pickers, public works, the National Water Commission, and at one stage there is an extraction company, a small extraction company, so at the industrial scale or mechanized scale, and which will modify the relationship or this system and defines new power relationship, because this company is often associated with the mayor of the municipality, who is associated with the company, but is also usually a landowner who owns land on the banks, associated with a family, political party, and of course then election process, political party, elections associated with public works, again in turn in relation with the company of the gentleman, and of course makes it possible to fuel the industrial activity of the sand plants owned by this gentleman. So we're talking about politics here in the sense that there is a cronyism, clientelism, and what we call the caciquism. That is the advent of several political and economic relationship around a central actor who owns political power, economic power, who owns land, and who is also the industrialist of the local or the municipality. So what are the environmental consequences of this activity? Well, there are very few studies on the Usumacinta sediments. It is therefore difficult to obtain technical data. I will just talk about the representations at the local level. Well, in general, it is considered that sediment extraction in Mexico is a positive activity. It is an activity which will prevent floods, and I examined all the environmental impact authorization and the environmental impact information of the Usumacinta. And in every case, in all cases, it is noted that sediment extraction is a positive activity in as much as it makes it possible to prevent floods or mitigate floods to which population is exposed. So it's not just the discourse from the local population or the sand divers or the industrialists. It is a discourse from the Ministry of the Environment, of the government, that is extracting or to dredge sediments from the river is a positive action for the environment. In fact, in most cases, the actors, be they sand workers or inhabitants, usually they mention that this is an activity that has no effect in as much as sediments are endless. And the sand divers were telling us in April 2019, the river produces the sand from the inside. It comes because it regenerates alone thanks to the flow. So this idea of an endless resource, which comes almost like by magic from the river, it's an endless source, sediment. And therefore, indeed, what they observe that there is an annual renewal of sandbanks, be they on the shores or be they in the riverbed. Yet, despite the presence of the fact that there is no change, well, sand divers admit that sometimes, the sandbank is smaller, there is less sand, you have to dive deeper, or it has shifted along the river run. So there is an understanding of changes, and in some cases, actually, it can be observed that, especially on this photo on the left-hand side, the formation of a small island, and several persons took us to see it and to say this island appeared when the company started extracting sediment. So eventually, there is the environmental impact is understood or perceived, even if in most cases the argument would be it's not my fault, it is the fault of the other village, the village next door, upstream, downstream, of the industrialist. And because they do it badly and not me. Another testimony which shows the understanding, this perception of endless resource of sediment. This is a site, this is an island, and the sand fishermen said the beach is, 2 kilometers long, 500 meters wide. Sediment is all over the place. There is room for everybody. It's endless. The advantage of this river, when it overflows, it brings huge quantities of materials, sands and a lot of gravel, but not just stones. God also sends lots of fish thanks to the water. So this is a dimension which, of course, has nothing to do with geomorphology or with water or with political situation, but which is associated with the idea that there is somewhat a divine power that will provide. So we talked about social organization. It is important to evidence the fact that local practices of sediment extraction are in line with social organization, or are linked with social organization, with land tenure and the economic needs. Of course, we talk about rural catchment basin with very poor population, and of course power relationship, inequalities. It is a complex heterogeneous phenomenon which depends on local conditions, which is anchored into the forms of local organizations. It depends on the actors present, but also on the various standpoints of those actors. At the international level, there are more and more scientific publications, as well as publications in the press, a lot of documents on sediment extraction and on the problem which is becoming an international issue now, which causes several conflicts and in some cases is associated with crime. So what about Usumacinta? In some sites we were able to observe several conflicts, even though it was not the majority. And it should be noted, well, it should be evidenced on June 14, 2019, on one of the sites. It is, the team, one team of work on this, one colleagues went there to where one site, well, basically an environmental militant was murdered because he denounced the sediment extraction or irregular sediment extraction in the Usumacinta, and he actually got killed. So we see several situations which are quite worrisome associated with Usumacinta sediment extraction. To conclude, let me remind you that in previous presentations where they gave details, they presented the work we did around the concession or the land tenure, or the land patent, sorry, and mentioned the fact there was a significant difference between those who extracted sediment in Chiapas and those who extracted in Tabasco. In Chiapas, they are artisans and they're small farmers, and site data indicate the importance of the ejidos as a social organization, whereas downstream it is more industrial, but there are also artisans. And what can be shown as well is that it is quite a complex reality, and the extraction practices are very heterogeneous. Diversity is huge. The actors are different, and the practices are different as well. Public information which is accessible is either incomplete, and hence the importance of work on site with the players, which will make it possible to show the diversity, heterogeneity. And from this in public information, we cannot think about a sustainable management of sediment in the catchment basin, a sub-catchment basin. It is not exhaustive, and we cannot get a real idea about what goes the extent of sediment extraction. Local practices are diverse, highly dynamic, and they are the crossroad of the formal domain. Legal is always the reference. Well, this is the starting point. Only reality and practices are completely different, and they intermingled with all forms of local and social organization. What should also be mentioned is that sediments are studied by disciplines such as nature and engineering sciences, but there is a need for social, political, and legal understanding of sediments within a perspective of sustainable management. Indeed, sediments are important in the socio-ecological systems, but this importance must take into account legal aspects, but mainly in the case of Usumacinta, local practices, their links, and the relationship between these local practices with the political dynamics. As I was saying, Usumacinta, there are very few existing technical studies. We cannot tell you what's the volume of sediment exploited, how it evolves. We do not have access to such data. There is no such data. It should be noted that at the scale of Mexico, to have an open perspective at the legal and political plan beyond the unapplied and unapplicable national water law, in most cases it is not applicable, but we need also a local perspective to understand the local viewpoints, because, as I mentioned, do not acknowledge the impact at the environmental level. In other countries, the crisis of sediments is receiving attention. It's not always yet the case in the Usumacinta catchment basin, but there are several elements of concern when it comes to conflicts, violence, and so on and so forth. To conclude, I'd like to show you a couple of photos that define different contexts for the extraction of sediments. Well, this was the Garonne River in Toulouse, in France, in the southwest of France, at the beginning of the 20th century, you see, versus the activities we see in the Usumacinta. This can be observed on the Usumacinta, but it is an activity that did exist as well in France, and where with certain number, there are certainly similarities as well as many differences, especially when it comes to social organization and the cultural and climatic dimensions as well. Thank you.